8 months ago, Estella Crane commanded soldiers in battle. Now she carried tea through the palace like a servant. The gray dress made sure no one would see her. Except today, someone did. The receiving hall was full. The Alpha King had called an assembly visiting nobles from the northern territories, 3 pack commanders, whose names Estella recognized from winter campaigns she had fought alongside them not 2 years ago. The hall smelled of candle wax and cold stone, filled with nobles pretending their importance mattered. Commander Floki saw her first. Silver-haired and broad, with the weathered face of a man who had spent more of his life outdoors than in, he had commanded the Eastern Patrol for 11 years. He had personally recruited Estella into the winter campaign at 22, having watched her disarm 3 of his best men in a training bout and then apologize so matter-of-factly that he'd laughed for the first time in months. He stopped mid-sentence. She watched the recognition move across his face in stages. The height, the posture, the amber eyes, then confusion, then something that passed through his expression like a shadow over still water. His voice, which had been carrying easily across the hall, stopped entirely. The men around him followed his gaze. Pack Commander Rice, who had told Estella she was the finest tactical mind he'd encountered in 20 years of service, went very still. Lieutenant Farron, who had been her shadow in the training yard for an entire season, did something complicated with his face and then went carefully blank. The silence spread outward, like a stone dropped in still water. Estella kept walking. She did not slow her pace. She did not alter her expression. She carried her silver tray through the receiving hall with the same unhurried precision she had always carried herself, and she did not look at any of them directly. That was the mercy she extended herself in these moments. Don't look. Don't measure the pity, or the shock, or the helpless anger. Don't give any of it a surface to land on. She was almost through. Then Commander Floki said her name, quietly, the way a man says something he needs to confirm is real. Estella. She stopped. She turned. The tray stayed perfectly level. He was looking at her the way people look at ruins a scar where skin used to be smooth. The men beside him had gone very quiet, and none of them knew where to put their eyes. Commander, she said. Her voice was even. She had worked on that. I didn't know you were, he gestured, at the tray, at the dress, at the whole architecture of what her life had become. The Queen requires her tea, Estella said simply. The silence after that was the loudest thing she had ever stood inside of. She could feel it pressing against her from every direction, the weight of eyes, the helpless fury rolling off Floki in waves, the fury of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and had no mechanism to address it. From the high table across the hall, she felt a different kind of attention. Alpha King Josh was watching her, dark-eyed and still, with that concentrated focus he had developed recently, that particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize and had not yet decided what to do with. Beside him, the Queen watched too. Monique's face was composed and pleasant, and entirely, deliberately empty of anything that could be named. Estella turned back to the corridor. She continued walking. She did not spill a single drop. Later, in the small stone room that passed for her quarters on the servants' floor, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. In the training yard below her window, the evening session was beginning. The crack of wooden practice swords, shouted instructions, the rhythm of bodies in motion, working, becoming something. She had spent 5 years of her life in that yard. She knew every stone of it. She pressed her palms harder against her thighs. She would not cry. She had not cried in 8 months. She was not going to start now, in this small gray room, over Commander Floki's face. But she sat there for a long time. To understand how Estella Crane had arrived here, you had to go back to a house in the hills outside the city. Old stone, good timber. The Crane family estate, 2 girls, and the silence between them that had started before either was old enough to name it. Estella was the elder by 3 years. Born in late autumn, her mother said, in a storm, loudly and with considerable inconvenience to everyone present, and she had conducted herself in much the same manner ever since. She came home muddy without apology, collected injured animals, once broke a boy's nose for saying something unkind to a smaller child, and felt no remorse when her mother sat her down about it. He shouldn't have said it, she had told her mother, with the certainty of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by her own convictions. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, and then looked away. Estella understood, in the wordless way children understand the most important things, that she was not going to get what she needed from that direction. She had stopped looking. Her father was a lord of the old kind, concerned with name and legacy, and the precise social mathematics of who owed what to whom. Not a cruel man, something in some ways harder, a man of fixed expectations, and Estella was simply not what he had expected. Monique, arriving 3 years later in the sweetness of early spring, had been exactly what he expected. Beautiful as a child, beautiful as a young woman, and possessed of an intelligence she had learned early to wear lightly. The kind of girl who made adults feel clever for liking her. She sat correctly at dinner. She learned the harp without being asked. She attended the social gatherings Estella avoided and came home knowing things that mattered because she knew how to listen. Their parents adored her. This was simply a fact, like the weather. Estella made her peace with it by the time she was 12, the same year she first picked up a sword. She had borrowed it from the estate's weapons store, a short, plain blade a retired guard had left on a hook, and taken it to the far field on a Tuesday afternoon, and spent 3 hours teaching herself the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. The guard who found her, old Perrin, watched in silence for a while. Then he walked over and corrected her grip, her stance. He came back Thursday, Saturday, every week after that for 2 years, without being asked and without mentioning it to anyone. Estella loved him for that. She never said so. She simply showed up. By 15, she was better than 3 of the estate guards. By 17, quietly recommended to the regional training corps. By 19, she was in the only woman, a fact that generated much commentary and much determined silence on her part, and which became less remarkable week by week, as it became undeniably clear that she was very good at this. Not just good, the kind of good that makes the people around you better, because they are trying to match something they can see clearly in front of them. Her parents did not attend her first commendation. She had not expected them to. Monique was there, though, alone, without their parents, in a green dress with her amber eyes wide, and something in her expression that Estella flushed with the rare warmth of being recognized for exactly what she was, had not looked at closely enough. She understood it later. The way you understand weather only when you're already soaked. It had not been pride on her sister's face. Monique never said, in so many words, that she resented her sister. She was too careful for that. What she had was subtler, a kind of ambient awareness that expressed itself in small, precise ways. A dinner comment about how unconventional it was for a lady of their name to spend so much time in training yards. A sympathetic murmur about how difficult it must be, always so much to prove. The practiced ease with which she drew a room's warmth back to herself so natural, so constant, that you had to be watching closely to see it was intentional. Estella had spent most of her adult life outside the family house. This had been mutually convenient. What she had not anticipated was that Monique's reach would extend beyond the house. Alpha King Josh arrived in the city on a diplomatic visit when Estella was 27. She was on escort duty, senior patrol officer, an honor her commander had specifically requested her for. She stood at the head of the escort in dark green with her silver rank insignia and had been, for that moment, completely and visibly herself. Josh had looked at her as he passed. She registered it, the pause, the subtle shift, and filed it under things that were not her problem. She continued doing her job. That evening, Monique had been introduced to him at the formal reception. And that, as it turned out, was that. The courtship lasted 3 months. Estella spent most of it on patrol in the Northern Territories, her rotation quietly adjusted, she would later understand, to keep her away from the palace while Monique and Josh occupied the same rooms. She had not known this at the time. She had simply done her work. The wedding invitation reached her in the north. She pressed her dress uniform and polished her buttons herself in a borrowed room at the patrol barracks, because what else do you do when your little sister becomes a queen? She stood in the 3rd row of the ceremony hall and watched Monique take the crown with the grace of someone who had been rehearsing this her entire life. And despite everything, despite the complicated geography of their history, something real moved through her chest at the sight of it. She had been happy for her. That part was true. She hadn't known it would be the last uncomplicated thing between them. The changes came quickly, which she later understood was by design. Things done in rapid succession are harder to name as a pattern until it is already complete. First, her guest suite suddenly needed for dignitaries. She was moved to the servants' floor, small but clean. She said nothing. Then her sword, collected with practiced apologies, personal weapons not permitted in residential quarters, palace policy. She stood in her doorway and watched it carried away and felt something cold settle in her chest. Then Monique summoned her. The queen's receiving room smelled of jasmine and beeswax candles. Monique sat at her writing desk in silk the color of afternoon, hair loose, looking like a woman who had not thought carefully about this moment. "I've been thinking," she said, not quite meeting Estella's eyes. "I'd really like you close to me. You're my sister, Stell. I want you nearby." "I'm already in the palace," Estella said. "Yes, but—" Monique turned, and there it was, that particular arrangement of her features that had always made Estella feel she was being unreasonable for having a reaction at all. "I mean close. As my personal attendant, I need someone I trust absolutely." The word maid was never spoken. The meaning was unmistakable. Estella stood in that jasmine-scented room and felt the specific, terrible weight of understanding something fully and having no recourse. She thought about saying no. She measured the distance between that word and what it would cost. She understood that Monique had already measured it too. "Of course," Estella said. Her voice came out steady. She was quietly grateful for that. Goldman found her on the wall above the eastern training yard on her third sleepless night, when the silence of her small room had begun to press against her like something with weight. He was younger than her by 2 years. Broad-shouldered and unhurried stillness that came not from control, but from ease. He pulled himself up without ceremony and sat 3 feet away and looked at the city and said nothing for a while. "I saw what happened in the East Corridor today," he said, "when she made you apologize to the visiting lord's wife for standing wrong." Estella said nothing. There was not a single person in that corridor who believed it was your fault. And it doesn't matter what they believe. It matters to me. He turned, plain, direct, no pity, no agenda. "You are the best warrior in this palace. What is being done to you here is—" Goldman, quiet, firm, "Don't." He stopped. The city breathed below them. "I know," she said. "I know what it is." He nodded, looked back at the city. "I'll be here tomorrow night. If you want company." He came back the following night, and the one after. He talked when she wanted to talk and asked about the northern campaigns, the narrow pass, what she would have done differently in the eastern border dispute, asked as though the answers mattered, as though she mattered. She didn't examine what that meant. There were things she couldn't afford, and Goldman was near the top of that list, but she slept better on the nights they sat on the wall together. 3 weeks after she had stood in the receiving hall with Commander Floki's devastated face burning into the side of hers, Monique called her into the throne room. Not the receiving room, the throne room, high-ceilinged, formal, built to remind everyone who entered it of exactly where power lived. The council was present. Commander Floki stood to one side, jaw set, eyes fixed on the far wall. Monique sat on her throne in deep blue silk, crown straight, expression warm and entirely controlled. Josh sat beside her. He was watching Estella with that particular attention she had been trying not to think about. "Come forward, Estella," Monique said pleasantly. She crossed the marble floor in her gray dress and stopped at the correct distance and waited. "The council has been reviewing staff conduct," Monique began. "Specifically, the conduct of palace attendants during formal assemblies. It has been noted that on several occasions you have been seen conversing with warriors and patrol officers during events where your role requires you to remain unobtrusive." The room was very quiet. Estella felt every eye on her. She felt Floki's stillness, the terrible stillness of a man preventing himself from speaking. She felt Josh watching her with something she couldn't name. She thought about the winter campaigns, the narrow pass, 5 years of field work, and the silver rank insignia she had earned and watched, carried away with her sword. "You're right," she said. "It won't happen again." She kept her eyes on the middle distance. She kept her voice even. She gave the room nothing. Monique smiled. The warmth in it was flawless. "Wonderful," she said. "You may go." Estella curtsied. She turned. She walked the full length of the marble floor in her gray dress, footsteps quiet, and she felt the weight of the room pressing against her back the entire way. She did not look at Commander Floki. She did not look at Josh. She did not look at her sister. She pushed through the great doors, stepped into the corridor, and let them close behind her. She stood alone in the stone hallway and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed through her nose and waited for the thing behind her sternum to stop trying to become something she would not allow. It took longer than usual. She was still standing there when she heard the side door open behind her. One set of footsteps. Unhurried. Deliberate. She straightened, lowered her hand, turned. Josh stood in the corridor. Alone. No guard. No attendant. Watching her with those dark eyes and something beneath them she recognized now with cold, absolute clarity. "You didn't deserve that," he said. His voice was low, almost gentle. She looked at him for a long moment. At the king who had married her sister. At the man who had watched her cross that receiving hall in her gray dress and said nothing, done nothing while her commander's heart broke quietly in the corner. "My lord," she said, and her tone was as flat and final as a closed door. She turned and walked away. She felt him watching her until she rounded the corner, and she understood, with the certainty of a warrior who has just identified a new threat, that this was not over, that it was, in fact, only beginning. He started with small things. That was how Estella knew he was dangerous. Men who began with grand gestures were manageable, their intentions visible, their hunger obvious, their pride, the lever you pulled to end it. But Josh began with small things, and small things were harder to name, harder to refuse without sounding like a woman who had invented a slight from nothing. A week after the corridor, she arrived at the kitchen to collect Monique's breakfast tray and found it already prepared, not by the kitchen staff by arrangement. Someone had ensured that the heaviest part of her morning was done before she reached it. There was no note, no indication. The kitchen girl who handed it over looked at the floor. Estella carried the tray upstairs and said nothing. The following week, she was crossing the eastern courtyard with an armful of the Queen's correspondence when it began to rain. Hard and sudden, the way autumn rain arrived in Artoria without warning and without apology. She had no hood, no cover, nowhere to go without ruining the letters. A cloak appeared around her shoulders. She turned. A palace attendant, young, careful, already retreating, said only that it was a gift from the king, and then he was gone before she could hand it back. She stood in the rain for a moment, the cloak warm and heavy, and smelling faintly of cedar. The Queen's correspondence pressed to her chest. Then she took the cloak off, folded it with deliberate neatness over her arm, completed her errand, and left it folded on a chair outside the king's study with no note. None was needed. The morning after that, she found a sword. Not her sword, the one collected 8 months ago. The one that had sat in her grip like an extension of her own arm through 5 years of fieldwork. This was a different blade. Newer. Finer, if anything. It was laid across her narrow bed when she returned to her room, wrapped in dark cloth, with a small card beneath it, bearing only 4 words in a hand she recognized now. "You should have this." She looked at the sword for a long time. It was a beautiful thing. The balance would be good, she could tell from the proportion alone. From the weight distribution she had learned to read the way other people read faces. Her hands ached for it in the particular way of a body remembering what it had been built for. She wrapped it back in its cloth. She carried it to the armory and left it with the duty officer and told him it had been delivered to the wrong room. He looked at her with an expression she chose not to interpret and accepted it without question. Goldman heard about the sword the same night. "He left a sword in your room," he said, from his usual position on the wall. The city spread below them, and the autumn air sharp with the first edge of coming winter. "He left a sword in a room," Estella said. "I returned it." Goldman was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been going on?" "A few weeks." "Estella, I've handled it." "I know you've handled it." He turned to look at her. "That's not what I asked." She looked at the city. A distant bell marked the 2nd hour. "He's looking for a weakness," she said finally. "Something I want badly enough to trade for." "And? He hasn't found one." She paused. "He won't." Goldman studied her profile for a long moment, with that quality of attention that didn't demand anything in return. "You know what he thinks," Goldman said quietly. "About why you'd say yes." She knew. She had understood it from the moment Josh appeared in that corridor with his low, almost gentle voice and his careful eyes. He thought she was a woman with nothing left to lose. He thought that her sister's cruelty had carved out a hollow in her, that he could fill that resentment was a door, and he had found the key to it. He thought she would want revenge, that she would take it the way he was offering it, and call it freedom. "He's wrong," she said. "I know he's wrong." Goldman's voice was quiet and certain. "I know who you are." She looked at him then. He was looking at the city, not at her, which was somehow the reason she could hold his words without flinching. "I'm going to tell him to stop," she said, directly, "the next time he approaches me." Goldman nodded once. "Good." Then, after a pause, "I'll be here after." She didn't ask what he meant by that. She understood. He would be on the wall, in the dark, with the bread and the hard cheese and the quiet that had become, over these months, the only place in this palace where she fully recognized herself. She was quietly grateful. She did not say so. Josh found her in the library. She had gone there in the hour before the household woke, the 1 hour that was reliably hers, when the palace breathed in the particular silence of a place not yet filled with the day's performance of itself. She had taken a dense tactical study of the northern border campaigns, settled into the window seat with the pale early light across the pages, and had been, for that 1 hour, not a maid. He came in at 1/4 the first bell. She heard him before she saw him, the specific weight of his footsteps, the way he moved through a room as though it had been waiting for him. She did not look up from her book. He crossed to the window. He sat in the chair across from her. He said nothing for a moment. The specific kind of nothing, designed to make you look up. She turned a page. "You returned the sword," he said. "I did. It was a gift. I don't accept gifts from married men." She turned another page. The words on it were not registering, particularly not when the man is mated to my sister. A pause. She could feel him watching her with the focused patience of a man who has decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. "She's made you a servant in your own house," he said. "She's made me an attendant in her house." Estella looked up then, because it was time to look up. His face was arranged in something meant to resemble concern. "There is a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." She closed the book, set it in her lap, looked at him with the same directness she had looked at opponents across training yards and negotiating tables and the long silences of winter campaigns. "What are you doing, my lord?" He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "You followed me out of the throne room 3 weeks ago. You've been arranging small conveniences. You left a sword in my quarters." She kept her voice even, precise, unemotional, aimed at facts. "What are you doing?" He looked at her for a long moment. The performed concern fell away, briefly, and something more direct replaced it. She found she preferred it. Honesty, even the wrong kind, was easier to work with than performance. "I think you're wasted here," he said. "I think what is being done to you is unjust. And I think—" "Stop." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "Whatever you think about what I want, or what I might trade for a sword and a dry cloak, you're wrong." His jaw tightened. "Estella." "Lady Crane," she said. "Or Estella if you must. Not Estella in that tone, in this room, alone, before the household is awake." She held his gaze. "I know what you're offering. I know the logic that she's hurt me, that I should want to hurt her back, that you're simply giving me the mechanism to do it. I understand the reasoning." She paused. "It's wrong." "Why?" He leaned forward slightly, not threatening something more uncomfortable than threatening, genuinely curious. "Give me a reason that isn't about her." "Because I'm not my resentment." The words came out quiet and clean, and she meant every syllable. "Whatever she has taken from me, I am not going to become someone who trades in cruelty to get it back. That's her way. It has never been mine." Silence. Josh sat back. Something performed fell away, and something uncomfortably real replaced it. "You know," he said quietly, "that's exactly why." She picked up her book. "Good morning, my lord." He stood after a moment, crossed the room, paused at the door. "I won't stop," he said, not as a threat, as a statement of fact, offered with the calm certainty of a man who has never been required to revise his understanding of what he is owed. She kept her eyes on the page. She heard the door close. She told Goldman that night. The shape of it, the library, The words, the particular quality of the king's final statement. Goldman listened without interrupting, with the patience to hear a thing completely before responding to it. When she finished, he was quiet. Then, he said he won't stop. He said it. And Monique doesn't know. Monique knows nothing about what happens outside of her line of sight. Estella said it without heat. It was simply true. She is playing queen. She believes her husband is devoted, and her sister is managed, and the palace is arranged entirely to her satisfaction. Goldman nodded slowly. The autumn wind moved between them. Below the wall, a night bird called once, and went silent. "What do you need from me?" he asked. The same question he had asked after the beta trials were blocked. The same words. But something in the way he said it now was different. Quieter. More careful. The way you speak around something fragile you are trying not to disturb. She looked at him. In the months of sitting on this wall together, she had learned Goldman's face the way you learn a landscape you walk through, often the particular line of his jaw, the way he went still when he was thinking hard, the difference between his careful silence and his comfortable silence. She knew which this was. She knew, also, that she had been not examining what that meant for long enough, that the not examining had begun to feel like its own kind of answer. "Nothing," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud." He nodded, looked back at the city. "You know," he said after a moment, "every person in that training yard would follow you, if you gave the word. I'm not going to war with my sister." "I know." He glanced at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. "I just like reminding you that you could." She looked at him for a moment. Then, despite everything, despite the gray dress and the marble floor, and Josh's voice in the empty library, she laughed, soft and quiet and real, the kind that surprised her on the way out. Goldman looked quietly satisfied in the way of someone who had been working toward exactly that. "Go to sleep," she told him. "Tomorrow night," he said, and swung his legs off the wall. She sat alone for a while after he left. The city below, the stars above, indifferent and steady. The wind carrying the smell of rain from the north. She thought about what Josh had said. That's exactly why. She thought about the logic of it. A king who could have any woman in 4 kingdoms, deciding that the one he wanted was the one in the gray dress, carrying his wife's tea. She thought about the specific shape of his desire, the way it had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with what she represented, something he had been told he couldn't have. Men like Josh did not revise their understanding of what they were owed, what she had not let herself think about, until now, in the dark and the wind and the quiet after Goldman's laugh had faded, was what a man like that did when he decided that the obstacle between himself and what he wanted was not the woman herself, but the woman's sister. She went very still. She thought about Monique, oblivious in her silk and her throne room, and her careful management of the world's edges, playing queen with the serene confidence of someone who has never considered that the walls she builds might not hold. She thought about Josh's voice. "I won't stop." The cold moved through her slowly. She climbed down from the wall faster than usual. She was 3 steps from her door when she saw it. A figure, slipping out of the passage that ran beside the king's private corridor, moving quickly, head down, wrapped in a dark, traveling cloak. Moving with the deliberate, ground-eating pace of someone who had somewhere to be and every reason not to be seen getting there. She recognized the cloak before she recognized anything else. Cedar. Heavy. Dark. The cloak she had folded and left outside the king's study without a note. The figure was gone before she could move, swallowed by the servants' passage, by the dark. But in the half-second of torchlight before the shadow took them, she had seen enough. Not one of Josh's attendants. Not a palace guard. A stranger. Someone with no reason to be in this palace, in this passage, at this hour, and every reason not to be seen. Estella stood in the corridor and felt the cold that had started on the wall complete its move through her entirely. She thought about Josh's voice. "I won't stop." She thought about Monique, asleep 3 floors above, curtains drawn, crown on its stand. Not a single wall she had built prepared for what Estella was beginning to understand was already in motion. She turned and went back the way she had come. She was not going to sleep tonight. A man who could not have what he wanted had begun to calculate how to remove what stood between him and it. The obstacle had a name. The obstacle was the queen. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark, with her back against the cold stone wall, and her bare feet on the floor, and thought, not the circular, exhausting thinking of a person caught in grief or anxiety. The clean, linear thinking of a warrior building a picture from available pieces. The stranger in Josh's cloak. The servant's passage that connected to the king's private corridor, a passage that had no legitimate reason to be used after the second bell, by anyone, least of all a stranger, moving at that specific pace, the direction he had been heading. Up, toward the residential floors, toward the Queen's chambers. She thought about Josh's voice in the library. "I won't stop." She thought about the way he had said it, not in anger, not in desperation, with the calm particularity of a man announcing a fact about the weather, a man who had already made a decision and was simply informing the room of it. She thought about what it meant to be a king who wanted something he couldn't have by persuasion. She thought about what came next, for a man like that. By the third bell, she had her answer. By the fourth, she was moving. The servant's passage was narrow and dark, lit by a single torch at each turning. Estella moved through it without a light of her own, her bare feet silent on the stone, her body low and careful, the particular way of moving she had learned in the winter campaigns, when silence was the difference between ambush and discovery. She had no sword. She had not had a sword for 8 months. She had her hands. She had her training. She had 5 years of field work that lived in her muscles, whether Monique had decreed it inconvenient or not. She took the passage to the second junction and stopped, listened. The palace breathed around her the distant creak of old timber, the murmur of wind through the high windows, the particular bass note of a building that had been standing for 300 years and had learned, in that time, the sound of its own silence. And beneath it, barely there, the kind of sound that only registered if you had spent years training your hearing to find it 2 sets of footsteps. Measured, controlled, not moving yet, waiting. They're already in position. She moved. The passage opened onto the antechamber below the Queen's floor by way of a narrow stair. She took it fast, 2 steps at a time, her palm on the wall for guidance, and came out into the antechamber, already reading the space. 2 men, exactly as she had calculated. Palace uniform, silver threading, precise fit worn by men who had not earned it. She could see it in the way they stood. Not the loose, habitual stance of guards who had worn this uniform for years. The careful, slightly overcorrect posture of men wearing a costume. The first one registered her half a second before she reached him. That half second was his mistake and her advantage. She drove her elbow into the hinge of his jaw with a force that clapped his teeth together and dropped him sideways into the wall. She caught his sword arm on the way down, twisted, felt the joints resist, and then surrender, and took the blade from his grip before he finished falling. The second man was faster. Trained. Genuinely, she gave him that. He came at her with a low, angled lunge, aimed to get under her guard, and he might have managed it, once, against a different opponent. She sidestepped, turned his momentum against him with a redirection at the wrist, and brought the pommel of the stolen blade down against the base of his skull with the precise, calibrated force of someone who needed him conscious but horizontal. He went down hard. The antechamber was silent. Estella stood between both bodies, breathing evenly, the stolen sword warm in her grip. She looked at her hands, the same raw, laundry-worn hands that had carried a silver tray through a receiving hall, while men who had fought beside her didn't know where to put their eyes. She looked at the blade. She looked at the men on the floor. She crouched beside the first and searched him methodically. Inside the lining of his collar, folded with the precision of something placed by careful, deliberate fingers, was a square of dark wax paper. She opened it. 1 line, written in a hand she had seen on documents and decrees, and the formal correspondence she had carried up 2 flights of stairs for 8 months. Remove the Queen, the King's seal, upon completion. The seal was pressed into the corner, the wolf's head, the twin laurels, the crown. Josh. A sound left her that was not quite a breath and not quite a word. She held the note in her steady hands and felt the cold move through her. Not surprise, because she had been building toward this all night, but confirmation, which was in some ways heavier. Surprise you could refuse to believe. Confirmation sat in the chest and stayed. She looked at the man still conscious on the floor, watching her with the glassy, recalibrating look of someone whose world had just rearranged itself entirely. "You're going to stay alive," she told him quietly. Both of you. Because I need a witness. She pressed the sword tip to the stone beside his throat, not touching. Present. He understood. Goldman came when she sent for him, within minutes, which meant he had not been sleeping either. He appeared at the antechamber door, still pulling on his patrol jacket, took one look at the two men on the floor, and the sword in her hand, and the note in the other, and said nothing. He crossed the room, read the note over her shoulder, and went very still in the way she had come to understand, meant he was holding something in with considerable effort. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need you to secure these two until morning. One of them is going to testify before the council." She held up the note. "I need this preserved, and I need the council convened at first light. The council answers to the king. The council answers to the law. Josh has given me the grounds to compel it." She met his eyes. "Will you help me?" He looked at her for one long moment, the look of a man confirming something he already knows. "I'll have the council chamber ready before dawn," he said. She went to Monique's chamber herself. She stood outside the door for a moment, listening to the silence on the other side of it, the silence of a woman, sleeping, without any knowledge of what had just happened, 6 feet from where she lay, without any knowledge of what her husband had ordered or what her sister had just stopped. Estella knocked. It took 3 rounds before she heard movement. Then Monique's voice, blurred with sleep and sharp with displeasure. "What in the gods' names?" "It's Estella." A pause. "You need to get up. Now." The council chamber in the hour before dawn was cold and still, the long table lit by candelabras at each end, the stone walls holding the particular hush of a room that understood its own significance. 8 council members in varying states of hasty dress. Commander Floki among them, who had arrived fully dressed, jaw set, eyes on the door. Monique was there, pale without her preparations, her hair loose, her robe clutched at the throat, but her spine straight and her expression controlled, because whatever else she was, she had never in her life let a room see her afraid. Josh arrived last. He came in with his personal guards and the easy confidence of a man summoned to an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. He looked at the council. He looked at Monique. He looked at Estella, standing to one side in her gray dress, with the note in her hand and the sword resting against the wall beside her. Something moved through his expression. Fast. Contained. "What is this?" he said. Estella stepped forward. She had thought, on the walk from the antechamber to this room, about what she was going to feel. She had expected grief, perhaps, for the version of her sister's life about to change irrevocably, or anger, finally released, 8 months of it finding its shape and direction. What she felt was neither. What she felt was clarity, the same clarity she had always felt in the field, when the situation was dangerous and the path was plain, and all that was left was to move through it correctly. She placed the note on the table before the council. Last night, 2 men were apprehended in the antechamber below the Queen's private floor. They were dressed in palace uniform. They were armed. She kept her voice even, her words precise. This note was found on the senior man's person. The council will observe the seal in its corner. Silence moved around the table like something physical. Floki picked up the note, read it. His face did not change. He passed it to the man beside him. It went around the table. Josh watched it go. His expression had settled into something careful, and still the expression of a man calculating distances. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice was measured. Reasonable. Anyone could have produced that seal. "The seal is genuine," Estella said. "The council's document master can confirm it within the hour, and the man who carried it is alive and in custody. He has agreed to testify." A beat. Furthermore, she did not look at Josh. She looked at the council at each face in turn, with the steady, deliberate gaze of a woman who has been invisible for 8 months and intends to be seen now. "I will testify regarding a pattern of conduct that preceded last night. The Alpha King has, over the course of several weeks, made repeated private advances toward me. He made clear his intention was to remove the Queen and position me as her replacement." She paused. When I refused, he informed me that he would not stop. The room was absolutely silent. Monique had not moved. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her face very white, and her eyes fixed somewhere between Estella and the wall, as though looking at something with no surface. These are serious allegations, said Lord Harwick, the senior council member. He looked at Josh. My lord, do you contest them? Josh's eyes moved to Estella. Something in them had shifted the calculation still present, but beneath it, something raw, the first genuinely unguarded thing she had seen on his face since the library. She's lying, he said. She resents my wife. She would say anything to. The man in custody has made a written statement. Goldman stepped forward from the edge of the room. He placed a folded document on the table beside the note. He named his employer. His instructions. The sum he was paid and from which treasury it was drawn. A pause. He was quite cooperative. Josh looked at Goldman, then at Estella. The calculation in his eyes did not waver, but something around it was beginning to give the specific, almost architectural way things give when the foundation shifts. My lord, said Harwick quietly, I think it would be best if your guards waited outside. It took until noon. The council's document master confirmed the seal within the hour, genuine, irrefutable. The man in custody gave his testimony before 3 senior members and did not deviate from his written statement by a single word. 2 council members produced treasury records that aligned precisely with Goldman's document. Josh argued for 2 hours. He was good at it, articulate, controlled, constructing alternative explanations with the facility of a man accustomed to having rooms believe him. But the room had the seal. The room had the testimony. The room had Estella, who answered every counter-argument with the same flat, precise calm she had once used in field debriefs, and who did not raise her voice once, and who did not flinch. At noon, Lord Harwick called for the council's decision. It was unanimous. The Alpha King Josh was removed from his title and his seat, effective immediately, pending formal proceedings. His personal guard was relieved. His private correspondence was sealed for examination. He was escorted from the chamber by 2 of Commander Floki's men. He did not look at Estella as he passed. He looked at Monique, and what Monique did, her chin lifted, her eyes dry, her expression composed and entirely, deliberately empty of anything that could be named, was the most purely herself she had ever seemed. The chamber emptied slowly. Goldman spoke to Floki in a low voice near the door. Floki gripped Goldman's shoulder once, firmly, and then caught Estella's eye across the room. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. The way a man nods when words are insufficient, and he knows it. She nodded back. When the room held only the 2 sisters, Monique did not move from her chair. Estella did not go to her. She stood across the long table, in her gray dress with the sword resting against the wall, and let the silence between them carry its full weight, the weight of 3 years of being reduced and managed and diminished by careful, deliberate design. The weight of a mother's favoritism and a father's fixed expectations and 2 girls in a house in the hills who had chosen different things and never learned to put that distance into words. It was Monique who spoke first. You could have let it happen, she said, not accusing, something she was working out in real time, turning over like an unfamiliar object. Yes, Estella said. It would have solved your problem. Yes. Then why? Estella thought about it. The gray dress and the silver tray, and Floki's face in the receiving hall. The sword carried away by a stranger's hands, 8 months of being folded smaller and smaller by someone who feared what she was. Because she was still my sister, she said. Even after everything, she was still that. Monique was quiet for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. Monique did not cry in rooms Estella had known that since childhood, but her face, stripped of its performance, held something Estella had not seen in years, something closer to the girl who used to come to her room in thunderstorms. I was afraid of you, Monique said, not as an excuse, as a fact. I know, they loved you for things I could never be. Her voice was careful and cost her something Estella could see clearly. I couldn't compete with you in the ways that mattered to you, so I competed in the only way I could, by taking the ways that mattered to me away. Yes, a long pause. It was wrong. The words landed without adornment. What I did to you was wrong. The beta position, the sword. Making you carry my tea in front of men who had fought beside you. Her jaw moved. I knew it, and I did it anyway, because I was small enough to. Estella stood with that for a moment. The anger was there clean and quiet, the thing that had kept her upright through 8 months of gray wool and laundry water. but anger and truth could exist in the same room. She had learned that in the field. "I know why you did it," she said. "That doesn't make it right, but I know why." Monique nodded. She looked at the table. "I'll speak to the council," she said quietly. "About your commission, your rank, everything that was taken." She paused. "I'll step back from the public role. A crown doesn't fit as well when you've only ever worn it to keep someone else from having it." "I'm sorry," Monique said, the plainest 3 words she had perhaps ever spoken. "For all of it. For years of it." Estella stood in the cold, still chamber with the morning light coming pale and new through the high windows, and let the words settle into the space where 8 months of careful endurance had lived. "I'll hold you to the council," she said, "and to the commission." It was not forgiveness. Entirely. Not yet. Forgiveness was not a door you opened once in a cold council chamber at noon. It was something built over time, stone by stone, with actions rather than words. But it was a beginning. Monique stood, straightened her robe, and walked out of the chamber with her back straight and her head high, which was the only way she had ever known how to leave a room. Estella watched her go. Goldman was waiting in the corridor, not hovering, simply there, leaning against the stone wall across from the chamber door, with his arms crossed and his expression doing the careful, controlled thing it did when he was holding a great deal in. She stopped in front of him. The morning light came through the corridor window and lay across the stone floor between them, pale gold and steady. "It's done," she said. "I know." He studied her face. "How are you?" She thought about it honestly. The sword in her hand, the note on the table, Monique's voice saying, "I was afraid of you." Floki nodding across an empty room. The beta commission that would at last carry her name. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm going to need somewhere to sit down." Goldman pushed off the wall. "I know a wall," he said. She looked at him. Something moved between them in the quiet corridor. Something that had been building on a parapet above the training yard, over months of bread and hard cheese and honest silence. Something she had spent a long time not examining, because there were things she couldn't afford, and Goldman had been near the top of that list. The list was shorter now. "Goldman?" she said. "Yes. I have something to say, and I'd like to say it before I lose my nerve, which won't happen for long but is currently happening briefly, so." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right. You stayed," she said. "Every night on that wall you stayed. When the beta commission was blocked, when Josh was in the library, when I needed to say things out loud so they would stop pressing against the inside of my chest. You stayed and you didn't ask for anything in return, and you didn't treat my situation like a wound that required careful handling. You treated me like I was exactly who I am. And I don't know how to tell you what that has meant, except that I think you might be the only reason I didn't lose myself entirely in that gray dress." Goldman was very still. "I'm done not examining things," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the pale morning light, with the city beginning to wake around them and the training yard calling its familiar rhythm through the walls. "I've been waiting," he said. "A very patient amount of time for you to say something like that." "How patient?" "Since the 3rd night on the wall." His voice was quiet. "When you said that and a copper coin and laughed about it even though nothing was funny, I thought, there she is. That's who she is under all of this." He paused. "I've been watching you hold yourself together in that gray dress for 8 months, and every single day I thought the same thing." "What thing?" "That the palace doesn't deserve you. That the gray dress doesn't deserve you." His eyes held hers. "That I hoped, when it was over, you might choose someone who did." The morning light lay between them, steady and unhurried. "Goldman," she said. "Yes. I choose you." He crossed the distance and she let him, which was itself a new thing, a thing that had not been available to her when she was smaller, when she was managed, when she was the woman in the gray dress carrying silver trays. He pulled her close and she pressed her forehead against his jaw and felt, for the first time in 8 months, the specific, rare relief of putting down something very heavy. They stood like that in the corridor for a while, the city waking outside and the training yard calling below, and the long, gray, diminished season of her life finally, irrevocably, behind her. 3 weeks later, Estella Crane stood in the training yard in dark green, not the dress uniform she had worn to her sister's wedding, polished and formal. Her patrol jacket, old leather, worn at the elbows, smelling of fieldwork and winter campaigns and 5 years of being exactly who she was. Commander Floki had returned it the morning after the council, along with her rank insignia and a handshake that lasted longer than necessary and communicated a great deal more. The yard was full. Word had traveled the way things traveled in a palace, quietly, thoroughly, and everywhere at once. Warriors who had watched her cross the receiving hall in gray wool now watched her cross the training yard in dark green, and the quality of the watching was entirely different. She stopped in the center of the yard. She thought about old Perrin in the far field on a Tuesday afternoon, correcting her grip with the patience of someone who recognized a thing worth recognizing. She thought about Goldman at the edge of the yard, watching her with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose faith has been, finally and completely, vindicated. She thought about Monique, who had gone to the council as she promised, and had begun the slow, unglamorous work of making right what had been made wrong, which was harder than wearing a crown, and required a different kind of courage. Commander Floki stepped forward. He held out the Beta Commission, the leather folder she had heard described in a council hall a year ago, and had stopped letting herself want. She took it with steady hands. "Welcome back," Floki said. She opened her mouth to respond. "Estella." Goldman's voice from the edge of the yard. She looked at him. He was holding something up. Small, dark, familiar. The card from the wrapped cloth. 4 words in Josh's handwriting. "You should have this." He was laughing. She was already laughing. Around the yard, warriors exchanged glances with the bewilderment of people who have missed context, but are glad of the warmth. She shook Floki's hand. She took her place. The training yard settled into its rhythm around her. The crack of practice blades, the shouted instructions, the particular sound of bodies in motion, working, becoming something. She was exactly where she had always been meant to be. She was exactly who she had always been. Nobody was going to put her in a gray dress again. If this story found you, if Estella's fight felt familiar, or Goldman's patience felt like something you've been waiting to see, or if you simply needed to watch someone refuse to be made small, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe so you never miss a story. New audiobooks drop every week, and there are a great many more women in the wrong dresses waiting to find their way back to themselves. Leave a comment? Tell me which moment stayed with you. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.